Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Phillips. I'm director of the Russian and East European Institute at Indiana University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second panel of a two-panel conversation on Do Black Lives Matter in Russia? Historical Perspectives and Contemporary Realities. I'd like to thank the units and the sponsors and individuals who have made this event possible, including the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies, the Russian and East European Institute, Indiana University's Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies, and the Russian Studies Workshop, a training and research hub for Russian studies here at Indiana University, sponsored by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And of course, we warmly thank all of our panelists who have agreed to engage in this important conversation. Last week's panel, which focused on history, brought together three distinguished scholars: Raquel Green from Grinnell University, Kimberly St. Julian-Varnon from the University of Pennsylvania, and Maxime Matusevich from Seton Hall, for a discussion about histories of and historical discourses on race, race relations, blackness, and otherness in Russia. That panel was recorded and is archived on YouTube, and we will drop a link to the YouTube channel for you in the chat in case you would like to refer to panel 1. We continue that conversation today with panel 2, which focuses on contemporary realities and of discourses on and experiences of racial difference and blackness in Russia. And our panelists will focus in particular on popular media and public response in Russia to the Black Lives Matter movement. The panelists will each speak for 10 to 15 minutes, after which they will engage in a moderated conversation. And then there will be a Q&A with the audience questions during the latter part of the event. So we do invite you to drop your questions for the panelists into the chat function on Facebook or into the Q&A function if you're joining us in Zoom. Please do go to our dedicated event website at rsw.indiana.edu for full professional profiles of all our panelists and links to their publications. And we also ask our audience members to please take a very short event survey, either by accessing the survey link in the Facebook chat or on Zoom in the Q&A. And you can also access that survey link by going to the Russian Studies website, Russian Studies Workshop website. Again, that is rsw.indiana.edu. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's panel, Elliott Bornstein, who will then introduce the other esteemed panelists and begin today's conversation about Do Black Lives Matter in Russia. Elliott Bornstein is professor of Russian and Slavic Studies and senior academic convener for the Global Network at New York University. He is author of Men Without Women, Masculinity and Revolution in Russian Fiction, 1917 to 1929, Overkill, Sex and Violence in Contemporary Russian Popular Culture, Plots Against Russia, Conspiracy and Fantasy After Socialism, and Pussy Riot, Speaking Punk to Power, which is to be released on November 12, 2020. Elliott's current projects include the recently submitted Russia's Alien Nations, The Secret Identities of Post-Socialism, Marvel Comics in the 1970s, The World Inside Your Head, which was serialized in draft form through Cornell University Press and as a blog, and Meanwhile in Russia, ... Russian Internet Memes and Viral Video. This is under contract with Bloomsbury Press. After that, Eliot will begin working on HBO's The Leftovers, Mourning and Melancholy on premium cable. So as you can see, Elliott Bornstein is a very eclectic and very busy scholar, and we are very lucky and delighted to have him moderating today's panel. Thank you, Elliott. I think you're muted, Elliott.
Well, that was a rookie mistake. Thank you, Sarah, for that warm introduction and for inviting me to MC today's event. I saw the first panel on YouTube at double speed, which made everybody double clever. And I think it was fantastic. And I recommend to everybody, when this is done, go back to YouTube and watch the previous panel. I suspect that the two panels as designed will work really well together. So I just want to give a brief explanation of the format today. So as Sarah indicated, we're going to have one person speak and then a moderated conversation and then go on further and then have question and answer. You will hear me somewhere roughly at the 12 or 13 minute mark indicating how much time is left. That's for the speakers, obviously, not for you. And we're going to be going in alphabetical order because I think that's the most convenient way to do it, and not because it's always advantageous to me because my last name starts with B. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first panelist, Dmitry Dubrowski, Dmitry, if you could turn on your camera, that would be great. Dmitry Dubrowski, who is an associate professor at the School of Politics and Governance at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. Dubrowski is an expert on human rights in Russia, who focuses primarily on xenophobia, ultra-right nationalism, hate crimes, and hate speech as they relate to freedom of conscience and freedom of speech. So Dmitry, please tell us what you'd like us to know about Black Lives Matter and race relations in Russia today and in the media.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be in this fantastic conversation, and I was especially enjoyed the previous conversation, which says a lot to probably to understand the current context we are living in, and that probably what I'll try to review today as just a flashback what was going on around the BLM in the responses of Russian media. And my general outline will be the follow. The Russian racism somehow had been converted with their social protest, and that's very important outcome which I can probably could bring today for the conversation. But let me start with the very brief. Sorry, that's in Russia, but it's just very easy to explain. This is just the graphs, how there's the different, how frequently the BLM in comparing with the coronavirus crisis had been mentioned in the Russian media, mostly in Russian internet. And here is the murder of George Floyd here in the May 26th, and here is the Blackout Tuesday. So even in the Blackout Tuesday, it was not more or less closer to the discussion of coronavirus, but the inner agenda of the Russian media has been always concentrated fully on the coronavirus, but not to the BLM. But still, the BLM more or less was covered by the number of the different media, including the state media, including the independent media. We still have it. And what is the most interesting is to know the context. In June 9, this is very interesting, that I don't know whether it was somehow related to this crisis or not, but it was very interesting coincidence when in Bryansk in June 9, at the small Russian city, the Yandex taxi, which is the Russian version of Uber, driver refused to take his students from Africa, and it was fixed on the video. And when asked, "Are you racist?" the driver answered directly, "Yes." And interestingly, the Yandex company immediately fired the driver. But there was the very actively distributed hashtag Yandex Cook-Alt. It was began viral on the Twitter, on Russian Twitter. And most of the comments were the following: the company sucks under the so-called American tolerance, even fires the employee in the midst of the epidemic. So the most substantial amount of the Twitter user, they believed that this pure act of racism wasn't the serious reason to fire the driver. And the second problem, we briefly discussed it in the previous part of this seminar, but I believe this is the sometimes occasional but sometimes direct racism in Russian academia. For example, the scandal which had happened immediately in the midst of this BLM story with the Mark Solonian from St. Petersburg. He's a historian. He wrote a number of books about Stalin's time. And well, I can probably you can see the quotation, which is that's not full, is just the part of this quotation, which was well extremely radically racist, and it was the interestingly enough, the substantial amount of Russian scholars believe this is not very serious reason to expel him. What we did as a members of the Free Historical Society in Russia, we have expelled him from the society for the such not only the racist speech, but also for the speech which was certainly against the principles of the fair science and the historical facts. But this is very important to know. There's a number of Russian experts among the academia and academic experts. They are very much racist as well. And the very important, here is well, just the two quotation I made from them, and how the different state-controlled media try to put their, the BLM crisis in the United States into the Russian context. For example, Tsargrad TV, which used to be very marginal media, but now after the coronavirus crisis, it currently is listed in the 4th most influential TV channel in Russia. It is highly conservative and I would say highly xenophobic, and they try to explain that the whole world is watching with horror the result of the BLM, of the open door policy of Western countries. And while the Russian Duma on the slide simplifies the procedure for migrants to obtain Russian citizenship. So that the BLM is somehow, the Tsargrad TV tried to put this BLM story into the Russian context, explaining all these, black punish whites. And that will be soon in Russia, because the State Duma tried to open door for the economical migrants. And the RIA Novosti, well, the fully official source of information, they try to explain the BLM as just a weapon of the social destruction. They are a weapon of social destruction. And that is somehow that's rooted from the people who are they call the triumphant blacks. They don't use blacks, they use the N-word actually, who are forever supported by the state. So this is the very ultra conservative radical position, more or less mirroring I would say the far rights from United States. While the state response was rather middle, I mean seriously modest. The Putin just commented that what happened in the United States is a manifestation of some deep internal crisis. And then he explained it is this disagreement between the president and governors. And only one marginal politician, Evgeny Fedorov, he tried to, that called the State Duma to recognize the Black Lives Matter movement as an extremist organization. But it's really weird, because there's BLM has no representative in Russia, of course. But this is interesting. That's almost it I can find right now for the state response. But much more interesting to see the responses of Russian, well, so-called liberals, because they're, for example, Yulia Latinina, famous journalist from Echo Moskvy, he directly called the Black Lives Matter Black Nazis. Black Lives Matter, there's just a Black Ku Klux Klan, Black Nazis, violent, led by half-trained demagogue. And this is the Echo Moskvy journalist. For example, other journalist, which is used to live very long time in the United States, Mikhail Taratuta, and he explaining the BLM as example of bringing good ideas to the point of absurdity, and now it smells of both progressives' desire to abolish capitalism as a system and Antifa's happy hopes of achieving destruction of his ideal. This is, well, it sounds a little bit strange, but in fact in Russia, Antifa currently considered as an extremist as well as Nazis, and their anti-left sentiments are very much distributed among the this part of the, well, I would call it Russia Tea Party, because, well, Yulia Latinina is one of the, well, good example of best leader, I would say. Other Russian liberals like Ksenia Sobchak or Andrei Illarionov, they are also very much skeptical about the BLM, explaining, like Ksenia Sobchak, for example, any revolution and the end is about this. So that's their, why they're, you know, the BLM are destructing the other people's private property. And why this slogan, eat the rich. And Ksenia Sobchak is very skeptical about BLM because she believed this is the beginning of revolution. She is strongly against. And like Andrei Larionov, another, you know, maybe closer to the Russian Tea Party, the deaths of blacks at the hands of the police are largely due to their much more aggressive behavior. So this is purely a racist statement, but this is how the Russian rebels responded, well, substantial amount of them at least. While the Russian left, they look on the BLM movement in the purely lens of the social protest. Like Ilya Pranikov, for example, I'm quoting the BLM, it's just, you know, common anti-elite protest. So there's nothing, you know, about race. It's about the social protest. And Ilya Budraitis, my favorite left philosopher and social scholars in Russia, he believed this is the response of the Russian liberals in Russian, you know, even oppositioners to the BLM. It's because of the serious crisis in the understanding within Russia, the ideal world of the United States, ideal world of Western myth, and as I'm quoting, if the first version is the conflict between the Western democratic space and Russian authoritarian chaos, when in the second, on the contrary, the advantages of Russian stability should be recognized in comparison with the Western society flying into abyss. So yes, this is the most of the message through all the officially controlled media. So BLM is just another presentation of the chaos and degradation of the Western society, while the Russian never had such kind of experience, and we always, you know, try to keep our, you know, so-called stability alive. And I'll probably, if I have time, still just a couple of examples how how the social protests try to use this BLM into the channeling it into the Russian situation, because Russia is living in the situation with the growing police violence against the people, and that's why they are immediately after the BLM started, the people has invented Russian Lives Matter campaign. It wasn't very popular, it wasn't highly distributed, but the idea is also that they try to explain these protests in the purely social terms of social struggle. Like this Sapochnik blogger from Yandex.Zen, I'm quoting, "That is our Russian BLM in classic form. Whites are people with resources, blacks are without them. It is understandable why Russian blacks are furious and demand a law for all. They try to explain that their lives also matter." So that is the interesting attempt to ignoring the issues of the discrimination, the race, whatever, just simplify the story to the direct social struggle between the rich and poor. And even Belarus event, they try to use this mark, the trademark of the BLM, into the and it's very interestingly combined with some I would say sense of the racist statement, because this is from the Pikavu one, a user from Belarus used this BLM of so-called healthy person. And the protest Belarusians do not loot shops, do not break shop windows, clean up trash after themselves, and take off their shoes before standing on the bench. Bravo, fellow countrymen. That is very interesting how in Russian context, even in Belarusian context, these protests starting to lose their issue of their racism and discrimination, and moving to converted into the question of the social struggle, social injustice, and their fighting against the different layers of the Russian society. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Oh. So I was just about to give you your 2-minute warning. So we're good there. Thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. So there are a couple things that come to mind for me anyway while I was listening to you. And one is that I know that Americans are very self-centered, that everything revolves around them, but this does seem to be a case where what's going on in America is driving a lot of the conversation in Russia. And it seems as though there's almost like a quantum entanglement of American and Russian xenophobia going on here, that they're in this strange reaction to each other, whereas on the left and liberal side, there's less overlap. So I was particularly intrigued by the fact that the person tweeting, the tweeting that you quoted about Yandex Taxi used the name or the hashtag Yandex Cuckold, which is, cuckold of course is not a Russian word, and it's such a huge thing on the American alt-right. Is there a lot of imported American alt-right discourse that's playing a part here?
Yeah, that's is probably, well, briefly, that is very interesting. The fact that the arguments and pictures and even stories has been very actively translated to the Russian context. Sometimes it's very poorly translated. It's quite visible that it is translation, but that was very actively bringing and complementing these stories and disseminating these stories among the Russian blogosphere to prove for example, that's as well. I checked just one story from this. I'm almost forgetting this lady, radical leader of the BLM in Canada, in Ontario. That's who allegedly claimed the white men they're under they subhuman, and they cannot share the same rights with the real black. And this is everywhere. So literally in every story, when it's skeptical to the BLM, they quoted the exactly on this like an only argument. Mm-hmm. But this is very, very common. And in Russia, that's everywhere. They're using as an argument why these people are so radical aggressive, because they simply against this is just the racist like Latinina claim, this is the black Nazis against whites. Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually very familiar. It seems to be what in general happens in both the Russian media and the American right-wing media when there's anything involving so-called political correctness. They just keep bringing up the same examples again and again and again.
It's very, very close, very close. They almost explain, oh, that is the result is the policy of political correctness. Yeah.
Right. And Latinina, of course, is no surprise here. Latinina famously argued that apartheid was a good thing, and it's a shame that it's gone. This is kind of her brand. But what I think could be a little confusing to people outside of Russia is that the others, that you're referring to the liberals, and that the people you're identifying as liberals, I think you're right to do this, I'm not saying you're wrong, but the people who identify as liberal don't sound all that liberal, say, to American ears, or also like the Russian Lives Matter people. They seem to be picking up on a fairly old Soviet notion of anti-black racism in America, where you have the understanding that blacks are treated badly. Russians should not be treated like blacks because they don't want to be treated badly, not that black people should be treated better. So there's a lack of interrogation there.
Yeah, but here is interesting because that's everybody there from the liberals, they are sometimes right. They consider the Soviet legacy as something that can be acceptable, and that's why they criticize the allegedly tolerant Soviet policy, and that's as they rejecting this policy together with the current tolerant politics.
Right. So one of the things that is different about what these liberals are saying from what people we call liberals in America are saying is that in the examples you give, there seems to be no sense of developing a left or liberal anti-racist politics. And I'm wondering, is there at least the beginnings of kind of specifically anti-racist politics among the left or among the liberals in Russia?
Yeah, but here is the problem, because there's the anti-racist policies strongly somehow all traditionally and historically occupied by left.
Yes.
And that is the problem. And but like other social issues, because when we started to speak about social issues, you immediately turn to be, you know, that kind of left. And here is you immediately met the people with the absolutely different political, you know, affiliation.
That's great. Okay. Thank you so much. I think we'll move on from here. So Dmitry, that was wonderful. If you could please turn off your camera. And now Kimberly, if you could turn on your camera, that would be helpful. I am thrilled to introduce our next panelist, who is familiar to those of you who are Indiana University Black Lives Matter in Russia groupies, since she was in the previous panel. This is Kimberly St. Julian-Varnon, who is a history PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania, which is an accurate designation, but isn't particularly helpful because of her public profile, even though she's I believe a first-year doctoral student. She's a historian of Russia, the Soviet Union, and Eurasia, whose work explores how Black experience in the Soviet Union shaped Black identity, and how the presence of people of color shaped ideas and understandings of race, ethnicity, and nationality policy in the Soviet Union and post-Soviet space. She publishes widely about issues relating to race in Russia and Ukraine, and it's a pleasure to have you here. So take it away, Kimberly, and I will also keep a clock going just as I did with Dmitry.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us once again for this fascinating panel. I'm really excited to go after Dmitry, who just took my breath away with some of these quotes. And so I'm kind of retooling what I was gonna say, because I don't wanna cross over too much with Dmitry's discussion, but I do think some of the things that he says does draw a lot on my personal experience with writing about Black Lives Matter in Russia, in terms of some of the initial reactions that we saw to the Black Lives Matter movement in Russia. Surprised me, because we did see a lot of cross-pollination between the discourse about Black Lives Matter protesters, both in the alt-right and far-right in the United States, but also in the right and more liberal-leaning circles in Russia. We see the same discussions of protesters as thugs, as looters, including Ksenia Sobchak's infamous quote about looting Louis Vuitton stores was have to do about, you know, freedom. But also, as we saw earlier in the summer, the surprise ending of the reshowing of Brat 2, right? So you have the ending of Brat 2, they're on the plane, you know, Goodbye America's playing, and then you start seeing these random images of chaos from the BLM protests in the United States. And although it was arguably, they said it was accidental, you can't hide that juxtaposition of the current BLM protests being portrayed as chaotic versus this orderly, you know, leaving of America, returning back to the land that makes sense in Russia, and then the portrayal of Brat 2. And a lot of the discussion that I've seen on online forums and things like that, I've seen a really interesting inversion of what it means to stand for Black Lives Matter in the United States. And that inversion happens in Russia, but it's also happened in the United States. Both sides, both the, you know, Russian Lives Matter groups, the Russian liberals, the Russian right, and the American right, like to use Martin Luther King as an example of an appropriate type of protest. And of course, in the United States, we have Martin Luther King as part of our historical education. Students across the United States learn about Martin Luther King and his focus on nonviolent protest. Although we also don't, you know, we also aren't taught quite a bit about the fact that his nonviolent protests also wanted and led to this idea of social change. It wasn't just racial equality, it also meant radical restructuring of the American capitalist system to make that system more equitable across races. But that is kind of left out in how Americans are taught about Martin Luther King. And so it's really interesting to me now to see this discourse in Russia about be like Martin Luther King. He wasn't Martin Luther King. Like I've seen that kind of discourse in Russian, but both sides forget that Martin Luther King was assassinated. He was murdered because of the radicalness of his ideas. And something that I think we need to have a conversation about, and I've written about recently an article that talks about how the similarities in media portrayals of BLM, what purpose are they serving? Because you kind of have this idea of Russia as this white landscape, right? And so you see these far-right groups in Russia and these far-right groups in the United States, they're starting to engage with each other, including one racist group from Alabama started a website in Russian to kind of make connections with, their alt-right, white supremacist brethren in Russia, which was built on this idea of a shared white culture, which as a Russian historian, as a Soviet historian, it's hilarious because for so long, there's been this conversation of Russia not quite being European, Russia not being Western. And now we see these alt-right and white supremacist groups in Russia and in the United States kind of trying to build inroads here, right? They're showing a level of camaraderie that the anti-racist forces in each country have not shown. And I do discuss that because there is a considerable amount of absorption of these American alt-right narratives about racism in the United States that are leaking into Russian understandings of the current racial discriminatory issues in the United States. This also kind of touches upon some of the bigger Soviet legacies. And Maxim Matusevich has written quite a bit about how Africans were portrayed in the Soviet Union versus how African Americans are portrayed. So if you have African Americans like Angela Davis, Jackie Robinson, some of our bigger cultural names are exported to the Soviet Union versus the portrayal of Africans as people who come from poor, exploited countries, that shaped how Soviet people understood Black people, but also people from Africa versus the United States. And as we kind of talked about last week, the idea that African Americans don't have much to complain about in the United States. And I've seen it online and in responses to my own writing, Obama, right? You had President Obama. How could you say America's racist when you had a Black president? Which is fascinating because we literally see the same discourse in the United States. When Obama was elected, racism is over. And so this idea that you no longer have anything to complain about because you've somehow reached political equality by having a Black president, it underlies this fundamental misunderstanding of what African Americans in the United States are dealing with on a daily basis, but also how those issues are portrayed in the media. And something I've noticed in the United States as, the protests have been happening for, 5 months now, there is more focus on the violence. There's less focus on the positive and mostly nonviolent. I think it was like 93% of the protests for BLM in the United States do not have any violence. But this focus on the violence, which often isn't caused by BLM protesters, it's caused by these, alt-right protesters. This focus has dominated the media space in America, and it's also dominated the media space in Russia. And so that begs the question of what are these narratives that are being portrayed and how are these impacting African Americans in the United States, but also, and something I'm interested in, and then Amalia will talk about later on, how are these portrayals impacting the lives of Afro-Russians and African migrants in Russia, but also Central Asians. And I think this is an important aspect to include, and I try to include a discussion of Central Asian migrants and Central Asian residents of Russia whenever I talk about Black Lives Matter in Russia, because for so long, Central Asians were called Black, they were called chorny, right? They were constantly othered and they were racialized. And when you look at how Afro-Russians and Afro-Ukrainians and how they talk about Central Asians, they do feel a sense of camaraderie there because they've also seen how Central Asian migrants and residents are direct victims of racial attacks and racial discrimination, just like people of African descent are. And so these are two things that I think are really interesting right now in Russia that I kind of want to dig into with my research. Another thing I thought was really interesting, and we've been seeing this a lot on social media, and of course the world is not Twitter, thank goodness, but on Russian language Twitter and Russia Twitter world, the comparisons to Belarus. And these have been very interesting to me because you do, as Dmitry showed on his slide, these really negative portrayals of Belarus versus the BLM protests. Well, in Belarus, they aren't looting, they aren't destroying things. Belarusian protests are being seen as, one, absolutely legitimate, and two, as a civilized alternative to what's happening in the United States. And including the quote what calls them our fellow countrymen. right? So you're looking at shared understandings of similarity, and that's based on race. Why can Russians see and support Belarusian protests, which are always portrayed as positive, versus the protests in the United States, which are against police brutality, which Russia has a very real problem with? And so what I'm interested in is how do we get this conversation of Belarus is civilized versus the BLM protests are uncivilized? If we look at it outside of outside of how the media portrays it, what is the fundamental difference? But also it's this understanding of legitimacy. Because of Lukashenko's actions in the election, Belarusians have the right to protest because the election was illegitimate. And you have the Belarusian government using violence against Belarusians. In the United States, on the other hand, what happens is people are losing the idea and the very fact that the murder of African Americans by police forces is the cause of this. And if you lose that point, which I've not seen many reports in Russia dealing with the fact that this is the result of these protests, like the protests are because of this. If you lose that, if you don't focus on racial discrimination, the protests do not make sense to you, right? And I think that this is the key aspect, is when you erase the racial discrimination in the United States, if you operate under this umbrella that there is no cause for African-American exhaustion and anger with the United States, then everything, it doesn't make sense. And I think that's key to understanding the Russian understandings of the BLM protests, is if you do not see racial discrimination, if you do not think that racism outside of calling people racial slurs or seeing lynching as they were used to in the 20s and 30s, and even through the 60s, we saw constant references of violence against Black bodies. When we saw anti-racist propaganda from the Soviet Union towards the United States. But if you no longer see that aspect, and if that's the only way that you understand racism to occur, then you will deny that experience with racism when African Americans are talking about institutional racism. And I think these are really interesting threads that we need to study in Russia, but also they mirror some of the things we see in the United States with this fundamental lack of understanding of the role of institutional racism because of how racism is portrayed in American popular media. And I want to end with talking about some of the things that I've seen in responses to my own writing about BLM and in Russia, and why I was so happy to see Dimitri's PowerPoint presentation, because a lot of it justifies what I've been saying in terms of the denials of racism, but also the idea that people who are educated in Russia can also be racist, because there is this kind of underlying conversation that racism in Russia tends to happen when people are uneducated or they've never seen a Black person before. So this comes from ignorance, not racism. But what we're seeing is Russian academics, leading Russian intellectuals who are saying racist things, and it isn't because of ignorance, right? So it kind of pushes back against that narrative, but also the ideas of Russians being Black. And I've seen this conversation happening online, especially, or I've seen Ukrainians call themselves the Blacks of the Russian Empire. And I think the most bothersome aspect of this logic is that in order to say, like, call someone a Russian Black, you are denying the fundamentally unique experience of African Americans and Afro-Russians and Black Russians, in terms of these people, including Central Asians, are specific targets of violence based on racial discrimination. That does not underline or decline or make less important the police violence against Slavic-looking Russians, absolutely not. But what it does underline is there are very particular and unique circumstances that people of color have to deal with in Russia. And so when you say, or when you call someone, say we're Russian Blacks because we get abused by the police, you're operating on the currency of Black suffering to make that argument. And you're also operating on ignoring the very real plight of minorities in Russia to make that argument. And I think that's something we need to analyze and discuss, and also show that in our academic circles and things like that, that kind of language is totally inappropriate, because I've seen it and I read it from academics in Russia, but also in the United States in the field, who have said highly inappropriate things about xenophobia in Russia towards foreigners, equating that with racism towards people of color in Russia. And they're two fundamentally different experiences that we cannot conflate, because not only is it you know, violence against people of color in America and what they're going through. It's also violence against people of color and their very real lived experience with fear and physical and emotional violence in Russia and in the post-Soviet space. So I'll end there. I don't want to steal anyone else's thunder, but thank you for being here.
Well, thank you, Kimberly. And I must say, this is two out of three so far. People are ending their presentations 2 minutes with 2 minutes to go. This is, I think, unprecedented in any Russian-related event I've ever been at. So Kimberly, this is absolutely fascinating and sparks all sorts of thoughts and questions. When you talk about that, is it in Alabama, the outright group making the website in Russian? It's so ironic because it's almost what we want, right? You know, as Russians, oh, people are making websites. This is so sweet, and it goes back to the strange contrast that I think most of us are aware of, that the forces of xenophobia and anti-globalism are so united and have so much in common in the way that they express their hatred. And this is really important, just as you're also showing that we should be aware of the differences in the way that hatred is expressed and xenophobia is experienced based on, in particular, based on color or perceptions of color. So I was wondering, when you talk about Central Asians, I mean, you point out that in Russian, in fact, they were, the term black would be used for them. Basically, black always seemed to be about almost hair color. More than anything else, right? Because having black, trust me, having black hair is a little, can be a little non-Slavic over there. So 2 parts of this question about Central Asians. One, have you seen or had the opportunity to see any ways in which Central Asian communities in Russia are expressing support of Black Lives Matter or identifying with Black Lives Matter? And 2, given the fact that the term black has traditionally been used for these people who by skin color would not become, or by ancestry, however one wanted to define it in the United States, would not be considered black, what do you think about are Central Asians appropriating for themselves the term black, and how appropriate would that be in the Russian political context?
It's really interesting because I haven't seen much like cross-pollination between the Central Asian communities and BLM. But I also think it's because, one, you also have Central Asians dealing with like the Uyghur concentration camp. So I've seen some talk about that. But I think it's also this idea of appropriating the idea of blackness, right? Do Central Asians see themselves as black? And I haven't seen that a lot. But it's also, what I have seen though, is Afro-Russians saying they feel solidarity with Central Asians. And I found that really interesting. But I think it also speaks to the need of both BLM in the United States, but also these greater movements to understand how people are racialized in different contexts. And that we do need solidarity between these anti-racist forces because, you know, as I've said, if the white supremacists in Alabama are making websites in Russian, you know, we have a serious amount of work to do. And I do want to do more work on Central Asia. I read a lot of Jeff Sahadeo's work, who's done great work on Central Asian migrant communities. But I do think that understanding the treatment of Central Asian migrants and residents in Russia can help us understand these greater discourses on race and ethnicity in the post-Soviet space.
Oh, that's great. And you mentioned how in the Soviet tradition, in addition to racial slurs, the crime of lynching is what was often again and again brought up and thrown back in the face of Americans. Of course, we all know this. And it's interesting to think that, you know, one of the ways that can function is that I think in a lot of popular consciousness, lynching is seen as like thoroughly extrajudicial. That is, the police are not involved, even though we know the police are quite often involved, but they're not quite as officially involved. So that lynching fits in with a larger framework here that I think might have to do with the attitudes towards protest, which is that I think it might be possible that people, even on liberals and left in Russia, have been so conditioned by over 20 years of media discourse on this, that the most horrible thing that can happen is revolution. The most horrible thing that can happen is people in the streets, chaos. I remember at some point when Occupy Wall Street was happening, and there was Occupy all over the world, and there was discussions of things happening. There were things happening in Moscow. Putin said, you know, we will never have tents. Like as if that, like something about tents was just so absolutely horrifying. And everything then is put into this paradigm of color revolutions, which is a particularly ironic term given what we're talking about here. And so I'm wondering, do you think that some of the lack of sympathy or empathy or support for BLM has something to do with the way the color revolutions are represented, or is it more just a kind of the general lack of anti-racism in the discourse?
I think I think the fear of revolution and the fear of social change is definitely a part of it, especially with, and you see this in the United States, they're calling BLM Bolsheviks, which just like makes my skin crawl on so many levels, right? But this fear of radical social change, but also the people who are against it, what do they have to lose if there is radical social change in Russia and in the United States? And I think that's also very important in terms of the idea of chaos. If the images that they're seeing, especially like in you know, Portland, if they're seeing chaos, you don't want that, especially if you've lived through the collapse of the Soviet Union. Chaos meant death, right? It meant very extreme change. And so something that I saw, I think it was an article I was reading in Russian. They were asking Afro-Russians and African residents in Russia why they thought BLM wasn't happening in Russia. And some people said, well, you just won't see protests like that in Russia. It's not possible, right? Like they're like, you think the cops are bad in the United States, like that's not gonna happen in Russia, right? So if everyone, and also one of them mentioned, they're like, we don't have those kind of communication networks. Like we don't have a network like that to kind of go against what's going on. And then one woman said, if it starts anywhere, it has to start with Central Asians. There's more of them and they suffer so much that it needs to start with them before we can come in and say we also suffer, which I thought was really interesting. But I think the lack of anti-racist camaraderie goes hand in hand with this fear of radical social change. I think those work together. And
the last question, you also brought up police brutality, which is of course behind everything here, and that Russia obviously has had a long-term problem with police brutality that is recognized by so many people throughout the country. And, you know, I think there's always been a notion, or among some people on the left in the United States, that, you know, police get away with brutality because the victims are largely people of color, and so white people don't pay attention. Now they're paying attention more, right? But that if it were more white people being victims of police brutality, there might be more action. Whereas in Russia, it sounds like it's going the opposite way. Like, is it like with the Russian Lives Matter people, is it just totally fine when it's police brutality against Central Asians, but when it's against Slavs, this is an outrage and there's no connection being made? Or
it's really bizarre. And like, because when I started looking up the hashtag, I was like, oh, this could be interesting. I thought it was a solidarity movement, and it was not. And I think that is something, and I think, like I've talked about this too, it speaks to who gets to be part of the nation. And the idea that we as Slavic Russians, we have rights that cannot be denied and should not be abused by the police. So when you say, oh, we're focusing, like the BLM movement in Russia, the RLM movement in Russia started after the police killed a man in Yekaterinburg. Like he pulled a knife on them and they like killed him in the apartment. And so that happened. And then we saw like the birth of the RLM movement. And I've seen responses saying, well, we don't care about Black people in America when the cops are killing us in Russia. Right. And it still goes on this thing, like I can be sad for both people in both countries, right? Like this is possible, but still like RLM, you don't have people paying attention into it unless they're using the blank Lives Matter slogan, right? You're still working on Black pain to make your thing, you know, media worthy.
Right. So it's basically, it's like Russian hip hop. Yeah, and it also seems to fit in with a generalized fear that agitating for minority rights is taking something away from the majority, which you see again and again. Oh, thank you so much. We'll be getting back to you, of course, when we have the open discussion. But now I think it's time to move on to Amalia. So Kimberly, if you could turn off your camera and mute yourself, we'll have you back in a little bit. Amalia, could you turn on your camera and unmute yourself so that we can have your presentation? I'd like to, oh, there you are, good. It's my pleasure to introduce Amalia Zatari, who is a journalist and producer for BBC News Russia. She's worked for various Russian media outlets as a news editor, RBC, Slon.ru, and as a correspondent covering Middle East news for RusPLT.ru, and also terrorism and defense at Gazeta.ru. For the last 2 years, she's been working as a producer for BBC Russian service and focusing mostly on cultural affairs, modern art, and problems related to young people. So Amalia, once again, I will be watching the clock, and I will let you know if you're getting within about roughly 2 minutes of the end, but otherwise I'm going to mute myself and disappear. So please take it away, Amalia.
Okay, thank you, Elliot. 1 second, I will share my screen. So, when Black Lives Matter protests broke out in the USA, I decided to speak with the people of color living in Russia about how they encounter racism here. And when we publish their monologues, it made waves on the internet in Russia, and people discuss it a lot on social media. I think that because there is a common idea shared by many people that racism towards Black people doesn't exist in Russia. But according to experience of people I talked to their stories, this idea is absolutely wrong. So I talked to 5 different people, 5 young adults. One of them, Roy, is a foreigner. He was born in Congo, and he came to Russia just 3 years ago to study economics. And other people were born here. Isabel and Camila were born and grew up in small cities. And Maxim and Alena grew up in Moscow. So they have different experience. But all of them, except Roy, because he grew up in Congo, all other people said that they encountered racism at school, that they were treated meanly by other kids at school. You can read their quotes. They told me that they reminded about the fact that their color was different every day. And a reason of it is that children always look for a victim who is different from other kids somehow and start bullying him or her because of their skin color or their nationality or anything else. So children are not racist, but sometimes that happens because their parents are racists. For example, that's what Maxim is talking about in the second quote. I will read it. It wasn't just the kids, but their parents who were bringing them up to racist. When my mom came to a parents' evening and complained that the other children were offending me, they told her it's your fault for giving birth to him. And Isabel, for example, said the same thing, that she had to put up with racism at school, and she dreamed about moving from, she's from Yuzhno-Sahalinsk, and she was dreamed about moving from this town somewhere else. And she told that when she moved to St. Petersburg firstly and then to Moscow, the situation got better. All people I talked to pointed out that situation in Moscow is better than in other cities, in small cities. They said that people don't stare at them as much as in small towns but they still do that in Moscow. And they all said that they encountered racism less in Moscow and St. Petersburg than they did before. The same thing, Roy told me the same thing, that he never felt discrimination in Moscow, but his story is, it's really upset me. I wanted to tell you his story, but Dmitry already did that, so I will save our time. But actually, his story really upset me when he told me that, because I mean, as a Russian citizen, because he told me that Russia was first place where he encountered racism, because he spent his whole life in Congo and came here just 3 years ago. One of people I talked to, Maxim, pointed out that he assumed that institutional racism doesn't exist in Russia. The real problem in Russia is casual racism, which people of color here encounter every day. It's like people stare at them, asking impolite questions. Maxim also told me that some people move to another seat when he sit down next to them. And Alena told me that it isn't always offensive and it depends on the situation. Camila is a Russian basketball player, and when we talk to each other, I assumed that situation with racism in sport is better than in other spheres, because there are a lot of Black people, for example, in Russian football, in basketball, and she said that yes. She said that basketball clubs are already used to having Black people on their teams, so there is less racism around. But when she played for a Russian team, there are always comments on social media pages, like racist comments about why why Black girl is playing for a Russian team. When I talked to all 5 people I talked to, I asked them what they think about Black Lives Matter protests in the USA, and why, in their opinion, there is no such protests in Russia. And here is some of their views about that, their opinions. First of all of them assumed that there are just not many Black people in Russia, so there are no protests. Some of them also told me that the real problem is racism towards people from former Soviet republics, from Central Asia. They are people who encounter serious racism, and it should be them who should protest against it. And Alena assumed that the Russian society just hasn't woke up to it yet. And here is some possible causes of racism towards Black people in Russia. It's not like official causes, but it's what what people I talked to brought up. So first of all is first cause is people are curious, so they are not racist. The problem is that there are no many Black people in Russia, so some people just they maybe have never seen Black people in their lives. So if they see them, they are curious. Another cause is that people are ignorant. People are ignorant, people are uneducated, people not travel much, people don't see other countries. And the third reason is people are racist. And here is I think it's an interesting opinion, Aliona's opinion, that Russian men and women identify themselves with white European colonizers, and ignorance of history misleads them into some delusion of superiority. That's all.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you, Amalia. That was great. And once again, I didn't have to tell anyone the time. I feel like my watch is just useless here. The responses you got from the people you interviewed are absolutely fascinating. And I realize it's a small sample, but I'm curious to think about how this breaks down, built in part based on some of the stuff that Kimberly was saying, and in part based on stuff that's sort of obvious about the population. So on the one hand, you're talking to people who are born elsewhere and come to Russia. Black people are born elsewhere and come to Russia in a large enough sample that could be people from Africa and people from the African diaspora, particularly America. I don't think you had an African American there. And then you have people who are Black and born in Russia, grow up speaking Russian, and those end up divided into people from, say, the smaller towns on the outskirts, and then people in the capitals. And I couldn't help but wonder, I wanted to get them all together and have them talk to each other and compare their experience, because I was wondering, you know, when the people from, say, Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk, for instance, say it's so much better in the big cities, is that an attitude that would find support among their fellow Afro-Russians who've grown up in those big cities? That is, would they say, well, it's not so great here either, or would they recognize a distinction?
The situation is Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk is worse, as Isabel told me, who grew up there, because there are not many Black people in Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk, and for example in Moscow, people are more open-minded, more educated. So the situation is better here. But actually, she told me that she encountered racism in Moscow when she tried to rent a flat in Moscow.
Yes, of course.
Because, yes, it's a problem in Moscow, especially because in people who when you want to rent a flat in Moscow, you always encounter phrases like slaves only, because people want to give their flats to slaves. I don't know why. Not Russians, but specifically for slaves.
That's really interesting too, because you know, I've certainly seen that. And one of the striking things from, say, an American point of view is that apparently is not illegal to put that in your ads, right? Because that would get you into trouble in the United States. There's plenty of housing discrimination, but to be so upfront about it, it sort of fits in with Russian national stereotypes of, well, at least we're not hypocrites, whereas you guys out there are hypocrites about it. But it also makes me think of of one of your respondents who's saying that it's sort of casual racism rather than institutional racism. And I wonder, and just the idea of the phrase institutional racism in Russia or in Russian seems strikes me as loaded because of the question of the strength or weakness of institutions in Russia. And I wonder, again, I mean, do you think that the respondents' assertions that there's nothing institutional about it make it harder then to actually combat the racism because they're not trying to change institutions, or do you think that they're probably right and that it's more on a person-to-person level?
Actually, it's a quote.
Right.
It's the opinion of Maxim. It's his opinion. And in his opinion, there is no institutional racism. And I agree with you that I think he was talking about like institutions, like how to say that. I mean, there is a structural racism and there is a casual racism, and he compared it to each other. And he thinks that there is a casual racism, and it's the main problem in Russia for Black people.
Right. But of course, being able to say that sort of thing in your housing ads is, I mean, it's sort of the inversion of the American history of official like redlining and so on and so forth. That arguably it could be institutional racism because there's no institution trying to stop people from actually doing this.
Actually, I think it refers more to the problem of ignorance. People who write this are ignorant, and for example, if you see this phrase in the advertise, you just you know what kind of people you will have to deal with if you rent this flat.
Right, of course, yeah. It is a kind of self-identifying marker. Thank you, Amalia. So at this point, I would like to have all our panelists come back, which in Zoom means turn on your cameras, unmute yourselves. There we go, great. So we've been collecting questions both in the chat and on Facebook. So I'm going to be the conduit for these questions at the moment. And I want to start with a question for Dmitry. So this question is in response to Dimitri's discussion. Does the state policy map the examples you provided?
What does it mean? The state
Actually,
policy?
I'm not sure. The state policy map if there's someone out there who actually wrote this, I have a feeling that there's a missing word. Let's turn this around. What's the relationship between state policy and the phenomena that you're talking about? Is the state an actor here?
Yeah. Well, we briefly discussed it already. In fact, the state policy is to portray all the protest as a kind of a serious destruction of the social order. And because of this orange paranoia, as the BLM also is describing as a kind of, for the one side, the proof of how the disorderly chaos of the Western system in comparing with Russia, with the world stability. And at the same time, and of course, the proof of the degradation and the failure of this system of tolerance, political correctness, and the open doors policy to the migrants.
Thank you. Here's a question for Kimberly. This may be a rhetorical question. I don't think it's a rhetorical question. I'm editorializing. Is there accountability in Russia for officials, in quotes, who advocate racist discourse? Is there any repercussion?
Not that I've seen. I mean, I would love for that to happen, but I mean, compared to the United States, is there that much, accountability? But I have not seen anyone being held accountable for saying racist things. Like I was reading, I talked about this last week, like the committee of children, the woman who's head of the committee of children saying, like, don't have babies with these people who are coming to the FIFA World Cup, right? Like, you know, there isn't very much institutional responsibility for those kind of comments. But I think it also brings back to this discussion of the limits of institutions and understanding institutional racism versus everyday racism. And so I think that in order to recognize institutional racism, you have to also recognize that people are the ones who build institutions. So these people are contributing to these kind of things. But yeah, there hasn't been like anyone that I've seen get their hands slapped for saying anything like that.
Okay, and here's a question for both Kimberly and Dmitry. Specifically speaking of racist intelligentsia reactions to BLM, do you notice refrains from Soviet-era dissident utterances and positions vis-a-vis Soviet-supported non-white groups and peoples like the Vietnamese, ANC, Arabs, Palestinians, etc. in today's discourse?
Well, Rasen, hello. I know of the question. Partly yes, but again, so I would like to generalize the story. The biggest issue for Russia, I believe, that's when we are describing even the concept of racism, we should describe about Russia as a rather cultural, but not the classical one. And that's why when we are speaking about, when it comes to for example, there's certain level of xenophobia among the descent, that was the strange combination of the cultural racism and the political xenophobia. Because when, for example, when we are speaking about the anti-Arab sentiments among the Soviet descents, well, they just remember it was substantial amount of Jews who were oppressed by the Soviet power, which allegedly was considered as a support of the Arabic countries and Arabic terrorism. And that's why that's sometimes is rather cultural and political, but not the racism in the terms we are discussing, I would say.
Kimberly, do you want to respond?
That's interesting. I haven't seen much discussion of that. I've seen more of the internal focus of like Russian imperial legacies in Russia and Ukraine versus these Soviet era, dissident discussions. But I think it is interesting that there still is, I don't want to make it seem like everyone in Russia is kind of negative against BLM. There have been, very public intellectuals who support BLM and have kind of written against the grain in terms of people disagreeing with BLM. But I am interested in why don't we see this greater conversation of like support from these movements like we would have seen in the 60s and 70s in the Soviet Union.
Okay, and now I have a question for Amalia. Amalia, could you please describe the Bryansk demographics or community? We're just trying to discern why Bryansk is described by one subject as safe compared to Moscow. What would make Bryansk safe for a Black person in comparison to Moscow?
Bryansk is a small town in the central part of Russia with population for about 400,000 of people, I think. And why it described as safe? Okay, it depends on what do you mean by safe, because there are no any crimes against Black people, especially in Bryansk, and maybe in Moscow there are more crimes happen at all. I mean, not just against Black people, but at all, against all people. But what Roy told me is that Moscow was more friendly for Black people than Bryansk, because as I told before, Bryansk is small town, and there are not as many Black people as in Moscow, and Roy assumed that maybe people just haven't get used to them yet, because this case with a taxi driver wasn't like the only case of racism Roy encountered, because he told me that it happens regularly with Black people in Bryansk. Something like this. For example, he told me that once he wasn't allowed to go inside a cafe, and the cafe manager told him that recently there are Black students who didn't behave well in this cafe. So the cafe decided not to allow Black people go inside. So that was really, it was a real racism. And so I think we can say that Bryansk is more safe for Black people than Moscow.
Thank you. So someone on Facebook is asking if Kimberly can make it more clear exactly whom she's talking about, the state media or the opposition media in particular, when you're comparing BLM and the support protests in Belarus. That is can you segment that into different types of media, or is it something all across the board?
I've seen it mostly with like oppositionist media negatively comparing BLM and Belarus. It makes sense in terms of the opposition are the ones protesting Putin. So if you can see what you think are civilized protests in Belarus, it kind of justifies your own protest against Putin. In terms of state media, the state media was actually relatively moderate towards BLM in terms of their language, but also because Putin was very much, especially in the summer, using the BLM protests to talk about the lack of social control in the United States, right? He was using it as a comparison to say, oh, in Russia, we don't have this problem, we don't do this, right? And so I think that also shaped how the state media portrayed what was going on in the United States versus the oppositionist media who's negatively comparing BLM to Belarus. But that's also not to say like every, oppositionist Twitter account is representative of the entire opposition in Russia.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question for Amalia. When you interviewed your subjects, did they express any fear when talking with a journalist, or did they express interest or eagerness to have their voices heard?
Actually, they were really happy to talk to me about racism, except Roy, because he was a bit hesitated, because after this story with taxi, he started receiving really offensive and aggressive and racism comments on his Instagram. So he had to close his Instagram account. And he told me that he agreed to talk just to me. I mean, he said that he received a lot of requests from different journalists, but he refused to all of them and agreed to talk just to me. I don't know why. So I am the only journalist who interviewed him.
Thank you. A question from Emily Wong. Hi, Emily. I wanted to ask if anyone knows if the experiences of non-white people in Russia have gotten worse in response to the negative media portrayals of BLM.
I think, so what's interesting is I can't say it's gotten worse, but people have been kind of more open about sharing their experiences with racism in the region. But also, I mean, also the public outcry and anger about that has gotten worse. Like, so Roy, the student who was, the focus of the Yandex taxi incident, the hatred he's gotten online. Maria Tonkara is a more well-known Instagram influencer who has been harassed nearly constantly since she posted on Instagram about the racism that happened to her while she was growing up in Russia. Like, I have gotten a lot of hatred online from people who were not happy about what I said about racism in Russia. I found a hit piece written about me in Russian, which is always good Russian practice.
Congratulations.
I take that seriously. It's a very good honor. But I do worry, actually, that what happens in BLM can have negative impacts on the ethnic minorities in Russia if they're seen as if they are seen as having the potential to protest and lead to social problems. What can happen to them? And like, that is a concern for me.
Okay, thank you. And Mark Trotter has a question for Amalia, though I think it really could be for everybody if anyone happens to know the answer to this. What have more visible Afro-Russians like Yelena Khanga and Pierre Narcisse been saying about BLM in the public sphere?
What against Yelena Khanga?
And Pierre, so Afro-Russians like Yelena Khanga and Pierre Narcisse, have they been saying anything about Black Lives Matter in public? And if they have, what have they been saying?
Actually, I didn't see their comments about BLM protests, actually. I know that Yelena Hanga, she has been on Russian TV for many years, and she has spoken a lot about racism and about Black people, and especially about how it is to be a Black TV presenter in Russia. But actually, I didn't see anything from her about these protests. But actually, I didn't check that, but I didn't see this.
And I take it none of you have. I suspect it would have made big news if they had, right?
Alina Polyanska, she's a TV presenter. She's an Afro-Russian TV presenter. She came out and she said she was comparing Russia and the United States, and she said, at least in the United States, they recognize that there is racism. So that's kind of the closest to that I've seen. In Ukraine, there have been more responses from, I forgot his name. He's like a former Olympic wrestler, and he's the Verkhovna Rada in Ukraine, and he said that like racism is decreased in Ukraine, which is interesting. But when you hear his story, he talks about being better able to deal with racism instead of it not affecting him as much. He's like, well, now I'm famous, so I don't have to worry about that. I haven't seen the similar reactions in Russia.
Okay, thank you. Monica Irina writes, are there any support groups or organizations for people of color or mixed people in Russia that you might know of? Any of you?
Yeah, but I know in St. Petersburg, there is the group which is called African Unity. It has been established a very long time ago, but it's only one I remember. And just I realized in my university, in High School of Economics, they have organized a group of self-support for their African students. From the students from several particular African countries. They also organized the group of support to support themselves, but that's not very common, and their group are pretty small and weak.
I know in Ukraine, there's it's like the African Ukraine Union. They have a Facebook page, but yeah, I haven't heard of any in Russia. But I will share about the HSE in St. Pete's, because we do have students of color who will be going to Russia in the next couple of years, so that'll be helpful to know.
And Jakir Abdullah on Facebook is asking for books or reading recommendations that hint at the protracted connection between the Black radical tradition and its intersection with Marxism and Russia broadly.
Oh, there is one. Jen Wilson compiled one. I'll have to find it. She compiled an entire a book support list because there actually are a lot of connections, and she compiled that list. There's also another one on the Jordan Center's website that talks about that. So we can possibly get links.
Yeah, if you go to the Jordan Center website, you can find it. I'm glad that I wasn't the one who had to bring up the Jordan Center, because that seemed like promoting the home team. But yes, these have been posted and reposted, I think, on ACES. So there are people have been gathering these sort of resources more and more. And I think we have time. Do we have time for one more question? Let's give it a shot. In terms of institutional racism against dark-skinned people, if it did not exist in Russia before, arguable, I think it was already becoming worse precisely around the 2018 World Cup. I was in Russia on a Moscow-based fellowship in 2018-19, and although I had traveled nearly annually to Russia since 2008, this was the first time I experienced pretty blatant institutional racism. Once when traveling with the entire fellowship cohort, I was the only fellow of color to Kaliningrad. Airport officials accosted me near bag check and even tried to ask my white colleague questions about my background, needing to see my ID, even though I spoke better Russian than many of the white colleagues to whom they addressed these discriminatory actions. So in all of that, I think the question is was the World Cup in 2018 some kind of turning point in expressions of racism in Russia, or not?
I'd say that is rather the presentation of the very strange perception of the security measures, because they usually include the measures to check all others as a potential terrorist or suspicious person. That is why that's rather the examples of the regular racial profiling. But here's, well, it's normally covered there the so-called Central Asia migrants, and here it was the just more broadly because it was, you know, considered as a more international level.
Mm-hmm.
And in I was reading, is it Nikolai Zakharov's book, Race in Russia, and he talks about from 2010 onward, like there's been over 170 racially motivated attacks. So I think, so you have the question of, we've kind of dealt with this casual racism versus institutional racism. And I think what we do see is more forms of institutional racism in terms of you can't rent an apartment in Moscow unless you look Slavic. Not being able to get jobs. And so I think we are starting to see more of a turn towards the institutionalization of racial discrimination against people of color. But I do think it's interesting how I read Amalia's article, and I've read other articles about Afro-Russians and Africans in Russia. They do have very different understandings of race, because coming from Africa, a country which is Black, versus being Black in a country that is mostly not Black, the way they understand racism is interesting, because as an African American, I was reading about their experiences with racism, and the things they called casual racism are wholly inappropriate, and it's still very much, you know, it's like these are aspects of racism and discrimination that aren't acceptable. Like, you know, calling people racial slurs, asking, are you from Africa, touching people's hair, like things I've experienced in the region. So I think what's interesting is I do want to have like the circle of all of us sit together and talk about, well, what do you think racism is? And we can compare notes. Because I think what shows is there is no universal racial experience or experience with racism, and the way it manifests itself is very different.
You know, if we had a third panel, I would love to compare Zakharov's stuff about the rise in attacks, racially motivated attacks, with Alexander Kondakov's study of the rise in attacks on LGBTQI people. For all of the obvious reasons are going on there. But sadly, we are out of time. I also just want to point out that Kimberly did put in the chat a link to the Jordan Center's Race and Racism in Russia Studies link. So you should get that now before the Zoom window disappears. And I think it's time for Sarah to say something.
Yes, thank you all so much. This has been a terrific conversation. We have had a very active audience on Facebook who wants to thank all of you, says they've learned a lot, really enjoyed the discussion. Thank you all so much for bringing these issues to light. I love all of the comparisons that you were able to bring with your different backgrounds and expertise, and a multitude of examples. And I hope that this is the beginning of a conversation that we can all continue to have. It's a really important one to have, and you were the perfect panel to guide us through it. So thanks to you all, particularly to Eliot, our masterful master of ceremonies and moderator. And thank you to Amalia, to Kimberly, to Dmitry. And it's just been terrific. And for the audience, if you could please fill out our quick event survey at rsw.indiana.edu, that would be terrific. And we welcome all feedback. So thanks again, everyone.